Clara stood beside the rotting wooden shack that had been her home for 3 winters, her weathered hands trembling as she wrapped Thomas's pocket watch in a piece of faded calico. The red dust swirled across the barren field where nothing grew anymore, where dreams had withered faster than corn in a drought. She pressed the timepiece to her chest one final time before burying it beneath the lone cottonwood tree, alongside his worn Bible and the silver ring he'd slipped on her finger 5 years ago when hope still bloomed in their hearts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dying mining town of Copper Creek. Once it had thrummed with life, men streaming toward the mines at dawn, women hanging wash between the shanties, children chasing tumbleweeds down the main street. Now, half the building stood empty, their windows staring like hollow eyes at the few souls stubborn enough to remain. The Hartley mine had collapsed last winter, taking 12 men with it, including Thomas. The copper had run out anyway, they said. The town was bleeding people like a gut-shot deer. Clara straightened her spine and turned toward the cluster of weathered faces gathered near the general store. Old Martha Higgins clutched her shawl tighter and whispered something to the banker's wife. Their eyes followed Clara with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for what she'd endured. Relief that she was finally leaving. She'd become what every widow feared. A burden, a mouth to feed when there wasn't enough food to go around. "You sure about this? Mrs. Hartley?" Samuel Morrison, the store owner, stood in his doorway, his thick fingers drumming against the wood frame. His tone suggested concern, but Clara caught the underlying message. Her credit had run out weeks ago. The charity meals from the church women had grown smaller and less frequent. Even kindness had its limits in a dying town. "There's nothing left for me here, mister." "Morrison," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the hollow ache in her chest. "My sister wrote from California, said there's work in the valley towns, honest work for willing hands." It was a lie, of course. There was no sister, no letter, no promise of work. But it was a lie that allowed everyone to feel better about watching her walk away. Morrison nodded, satisfied, and retreated into his store without offering so much as a crust of bread for her journey. Clara returned to the shack one last time. Her possessions fit into a flour sack, 2 patched dresses, a pair of men's boots that had been Thomas's, a bone-handled knife, and her mother's worn shawl. From beneath the loose floorboard, she retrieved her life savings, $3 silver and a handful of pennies. It wouldn't buy her passage on any stage, barely enough for a few meals if she was careful. But staying meant slow starvation, or worse, becoming one of those women who haunted the saloons, trading away pieces of their soul for survival. She filled a cracked ceramic canteen from the well, knowing it would have to last until she found water again. The old women watched from their porches as she packed a small bundle of hardtack biscuits and dried beans, her last food, painstakingly saved over the past weeks. Mrs. Patterson had given her a small jar of lard yesterday, pressing it into Clara's hands with tears in her eyes. It was the kindest gesture she'd received in months. "Where you headed, Clara?" Young Tom Bradley called out from his father's porch. He'd lost his leg in the mine collapse, same as Thomas had lost his life. He sat there now, whittling, always whittling, as if he could carve himself a new future from pine scraps. "West," she answered simply. "Toward the valley. Maybe further." "That's 100 miles of nothing," he said, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "Desert and mountain passes. Apache territory, too, though they've been quiet lately." Clara met his gaze. "I know." What she didn't say was that 100 miles of nothing sounded better than another day in Copper Creek, watching the town die around her, feeling herself become a ghost before her time. She'd rather take her chances with the desert than waste away under the weight of pity and whispered judgments. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. In the weeks after Thomas died, she'd been poor Clara, deserving of sympathy and casseroles. After a month, she'd become the widow Hartley, a reminder of the mine's dangers. By spring, the whispers had started. Why hadn't she remarried? Why hadn't she family to take her in? Now, 6 months later, she'd become something worse, an inconvenience, a specter of misfortune that made the other wives clutch their husbands tighter. Clara tied her bundle to a stick, creating a makeshift pack she could carry over her shoulder. She put on Thomas's boots, stuffing the toes with scraps of cloth to make them fit. Her own shoes had fallen apart months ago. She wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders despite the morning heat. It would be cold in the mountains, colder still in the desert nights. As she walked toward the edge of town, she passed the cemetery on the hill. She didn't look back. Thomas wasn't there anyway. He was in the pocket watch beneath the cottonwood, in the boots that would carry her away from this place, in the calluses on her hands from taking in washing to survive. The wooden cross bearing his name was just lumber, already beginning to weather and crack. At the town's boundary, marked by a rusted sign that once proudly declared Copper Creek Population 500, Clara paused. The road stretched before her, 2 wagon ruts cutting through red earth and scattered sage. In the distance, purple mountains rose against a sky already bleaching white with heat. Vultures circled lazily on the thermals, patient as always. Behind her, a door slammed. She heard Mrs. Higgins' voice, shrill with gossip. Pride will be her death. Mark my words. Too proud to accept Christian charity. Too proud to know her place. Clara almost smiled. They thought it was pride that drove her to this desperate gamble. They couldn't understand that it was something far more dangerous. Hope, the terrible, stubborn hope that somewhere beyond those mountains, life might offer more than slow suffocation in a dying town. She took her first step onto the road. The dust rose around her feet, fine as flour. Her shadow stretched long and thin beside her. The only companion she'd have for the journey ahead, in her pack. The hardtack shifted with each step, a sound like bones rattling. The canteen sloshed half full against her hip. 100 miles. It might as well have been 1,000. But each step took her further from what she'd been. The mining wife, the grieving widow, the town's burden. With each footfall, she shed those identities like old skin. She didn't know what she'd become by journey's end, or if she'd survive to find out. But at least she would fail or succeed on her own terms. The sun climbed higher, already brutal in its intensity. Clara pulled the shawl up to protect her head and kept walking. Behind her, Copper Creek grew smaller, wavering in the heat like a mirage. Ahead, the road disappeared into a landscape of stone and scorched earth, beautiful in its desolation. By noon, she could no longer see the town when she looked back. There was only the road, the dust, and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. Clara shifted her pack to the other shoulder and continued west, toward whatever fate awaited her in that vast and pitiless land. The landscape transformed as Clara moved deeper into the wilderness. Behind her, the last traces of civilization had vanished like smoke. Ahead stretched a canvas painted in ochre and rust, broken only by towering saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels against the pale sky. The road, such as it was, had deteriorated into little more than a suggestion, 2 faint grooves where wagon wheels had passed in better times, now half filled with drifting sand. By the 3rd day, the mountains had grown from purple shadows to imposing ramparts of naked rock. The desert floor rose and fell in waves of gravel and hardpan, dotted with barrel cacti and thorny ocotillo. Every plant seemed armed against intrusion, every surface designed to pierce or poison. Clara had already learned to give the jumping cholla a wide berth after one segment attached itself to her skirt, its barbed spines drawing blood through the fabric. She rationed her water carefully, allowing herself only small sips when her throat burned like sand. The canteen grew lighter with each passing hour, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She'd found a small spring on the 2nd day, barely a trickle seeping from red rock, but enough to refill her container. The water tasted of minerals and dust, but she drunk it gratefully, knowing it might be the last clean water for miles. The sun was a merciless overseer, tracking across the sky with relentless precision. During the worst heat of midday, Clara sought shelter in the narrow shadows of rock outcroppings, pressing herself against stone that retained the night's coolness. She'd learned to move in the early morning and late afternoon, when the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely punishing. On the fourth day, the wind began to shift. Clara noticed it first as a change in the light. The crystalline clarity that had marked the previous days grew hazy, tinged with yellow. The horizon blurred where sky met earth. The few desert birds she'd noticed fell silent, and even the lizards seemed to vanish into their hiding places. The sandstorm struck with the violence of a living thing. One moment Clara was trudging along the faint trail. The next, she was engulfed in a howling wall of grit and debris. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, driving sand into every exposed inch of skin. She could barely see her own feet through the swirling chaos. Panic clawed at her throat as she stumbled blindly forward, one arm shielding her face. The sand stung like 1,000 needles, working its way through the gaps in her clothing, filling her nose and mouth with the taste of earth. She remembered Tom Bradley's warnings about desert storms, how they could bury a traveler alive or drive them so far off course they'd never find their way back. Through the maelstrom, she spotted a dark slash in the rock face, a narrow cleft barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Clara fought her way toward it, the wind trying to tear her pack from her shoulders. She wedged herself into the gap just as the storm reached its full fury. The rock walls pressed close on either side, but they blocked the worst of the wind. She huddled there for hours, her shawl wrapped around her head, listening to the storm rage like a beast trying to claw its way into her shelter. Sand poured through the entrance, building small dunes around her feet. Her dress, already threadbare from the journey, collected pounds of grit in its folds. When she finally dared to take a sip of water to clear her throat, she found sand had worked its way into the canteen too, giving the precious liquid a grainy texture. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. Clara emerged from her shelter to find the landscape transformed. The faint trail she'd been following had vanished completely, erased by the wind's violent hand. Familiar landmarks looked different under their new coat of sand. The sun, now low in the sky, cast everything in shades of amber and gold. She shook out her belongings as best she could, but the sand had invaded everything. It ground between her teeth when she ate a piece of hardtack, filled the seams of Thomas's boots, turned her hair into a dust-caked mass. She allowed herself a small amount of water to rinse her mouth and eyes, knowing she was using reserves she couldn't spare, but unable to bear the grit any longer. That night, she made camp in the lee of a massive boulder, building a small fire from dead mesquite branches. The flames danced in the darkness, casting writhing shadows on the rock. As she sat close to the warmth, memories flooded back unbidden, nights spent with Thomas before their small hearth, his rough hands gentle as they combed through her hair, his voice low and warm as he spoke of the future they would build together. "We'll have a real house someday," he'd promised, his eyes bright with dreams. Stone walls and glass windows, a pump right in the kitchen so you won't have to haul water, maybe even one of those new stoves from back east. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the images away. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford out here, where a moment's distraction could mean death. But the memories persisted. The weight of his arm across her shoulders, the rasp of his beard against her cheek, the way he'd whistled while getting ready for his shift at the mine that last morning. A coyote's howl pierced the night, answered by another from a different direction. Clara added more wood to her fire and checked that the knife was within easy reach. She'd seen no sign of Apache, but other dangers prowled the desert, four-legged and two-legged alike, as if summoned by her thoughts. She heard voices carried on the night wind, men's voices, rough with whiskey and distance. Clara's heart hammered as she quickly smothered her fire, plunging herself into darkness. She pressed herself against the boulder, hardly daring to breathe. 3 figures materialized from the gloom, their shapes distorted by the darkness. Hide hunters, by the look of them. She could smell the reek of old blood and badly cured pelts, even from her hiding place. They passed within 50 feet of her position, their conversation a mix of English and Spanish, punctuated by harsh laughter. "Said she was heading west alone," one voice slurred. Pretty little thing, even covered in trail dust. Probably dead by now. Another responded. Storm like that would have finished her certain. Shame to waste such goods. The third added. And their laughter made Clara's skin crawl. She remained frozen until their voices faded into the distance, heading back the way she'd come. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, her whole body trembling with delayed terror. She'd been lucky if they'd spotted her fire a few minutes earlier, if the wind had shifted and carried her scent. Clara didn't dare relight the fire. She spent the rest of the night propped against the rock, the knife clutched in her hand, starting at every sound. When dawn finally painted the eastern sky pink and orange, she was exhausted, but alive. She gathered her things with shaking hands and set off again, driven by the knowledge that staying still meant certain discovery. The fifth day brought new challenges. Her food was nearly gone. Only a handful of beans and 2 pieces of hardtack remained. Her water was down to less than a quarter of the canteen. The landscape had shifted from desert floor to rising foothills, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. Loose stones shifted under her feet, threatening to send her tumbling down rocky slopes. But with the elevation came a blessed change. The temperature dropped several degrees, and she spotted green growth in the protected valleys between hills. Where there were plants, there might be water. Clara forced her aching legs to continue climbing, hope warring with exhaustion in her chest. As the sun reached its zenith, she crested a rise and saw it, a ribbon of green following a narrow canyon, the unmistakable sign of a stream. She half ran, half stumbled down the slope, her empty canteen banging against her hip. The stream, when she reached it, was barely a foot wide and only inches deep, but the water ran clear over smooth stones. Clara fell to her knees at the bank, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply. It tasted of snow, melt, and stone, the finest thing she'd ever experienced. She drank until her stomach hurt, then filled her canteen and drank again. Only after her immediate thirst was satisfied did she notice the other gifts the stream offered. Watercress growing in the shallows, the tracks of rabbits and deer in the mud, even a few small fish darting in the deeper pools. She spent the afternoon at the stream, washing the sand from her body and clothes as best she could, gathering watercress to supplement her meager rations. For the first time since leaving Copper Creek, she felt something approaching hope. She'd survived the desert, the storm, the hide hunters. Perhaps she truly could make it to the valleys beyond the mountains. As evening approached, Clara reluctantly left the stream, knowing she needed to find shelter before dark. The canyon offered numerous overhangs and small caves, and she selected one that gave her a good view of the approaches while protecting her back. She built a small fire, confident that the canyon walls would hide the smoke, and made a meal of boiled beans and fresh watercress. The stars emerged one by one in the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. Clara lay back against her pack, Thomas's boots finally dry beside the fire, and allowed herself a moment of pride. She'd walked perhaps 30 miles through some of the harshest country in the territory. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, her skin burned and peeling. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt, but she was alive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The maps she'd studied suggested the real mountains began just beyond these foothills. But tonight, with water in her belly and solid rock at her back, Clara Hartley allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this journey. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay a new life, a place where nobody knew her as a widow or a burden. She would arrive there changed, hardened by the desert, tempered by solitude. Perhaps that was the only way to truly leave the past behind, to walk through fire and emerge transformed. The 10th day dawned gray and cold in the mountains. Clara woke to find frost coating her blanket, her breath forming small clouds in the thin air. Her body had become a map of pain. Blisters had formed, burst, and formed again on her feet until walking felt like stepping on hot coals. Thomas's boots, once too large, now fit snugly over the bloody rags she'd torn from her petticoat to wrap her feet. She'd climbed higher than she'd thought possible, following game trails when the old road disappeared entirely. The desert seemed like a distant dream from these heights, replaced by pine forests and exposed granite faces. But the beauty came with a price. The air was thinner here, making every step a struggle, and her food had run out 2 days ago. Clara pulled herself upright, joints protesting the cold and countless miles. Her dress hung loose on her frame. She could count her ribs through the fabric. The knife at her belt had become her most valuable possession, more precious than the few coins sewn into her hem. She'd managed to snare a rabbit 3 days ago, cooking it over a small fire and making the meat last. But hunger had become her constant companion. As she picked her way down a steep slope, the trees opened to reveal something that made her heart sink. A town. Not the thriving settlement she'd hoped for, but a collection of weathered buildings clustered around what had once been a main street, even from a distance. She could see broken windows and doors hanging askew. Another mining town, abandoned when the ore ran out or the vein proved false. But abandoned didn't mean empty. Clara had learned to read the signs of human presence: fresh horse droppings, smoke rising from chimneys, laundry hanging between buildings. This ghost town showed none of those signs. But she approached carefully anyway, keeping to the tree line until she was certain. The town revealed itself slowly as she drew closer. Silver Falls, Est. 1,882 inches proclaimed a sign that had fallen and now leaned against a hitching post. The buildings stood like tombstones, a general store with shelves visible through the broken windows, a hotel with fancy gingerbread trim now gray with weather, a saloon with bat-wing doors frozen permanently open. Clara's steps echoed hollowly on the wooden boardwalk. In the general store, she found nothing but dust and mouse droppings. The cash register stood open, empty of everything but a family of spiders. She checked the storeroom, hoping for overlooked cans or sacks of grain, but previous scavengers had been thorough. At the well in the town center, she lowered the bucket hopefully. It came up dry. The rope frayed and rotten. The pump handle broke off in her hand when she tried it, red rust flaking onto her palm. Even the rain barrels were cracked and empty. Exhaustion drove her to seek shelter as the afternoon sun began its descent. The hotel seemed the most intact structure, its upper floor still roofed and solid. Clara climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step. The hallway stretched before her, doors standing open to reveal rooms furnished with iron bedsteads and washstands, everything covered in a thick layer of dust. In one room, she found something that made her pause: a woman's traveling trunk, still latched. Inside were dresses far finer than anything she'd owned, silk and velvet in rich colors now faded with time. Beneath the clothing, wrapped in oilcloth, she discovered treasure: a tin of crackers, miraculously preserved, and a small jar of honey crystallized but edible. Clara sat on the dusty bed and ate slowly, savoring each bite. The crackers were stale but filling, the honey sharp with age but still sweet. As she ate, she noticed other remnants of the room's last occupant: a Bible on the nightstand, a pair of kid gloves draped over a chair, a photograph of a young couple in a silver frame. Night was falling when she heard the sound wagon wheels and horses' hooves on the road below. Clara crept to the window and peered through the dirty glass. A freight wagon pulled by 4 mules was making its way down the main street, driven by a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Her first instinct was to hide, remembering the hide hunters, but desperation overcame caution. She hurried downstairs and stepped onto the boardwalk just as the wagon drew even with the hotel. The driver pulled up short, clearly surprised to see anyone in the dead town. He was older than she'd first thought, with steel-gray hair and a face weathered by decades of sun and wind. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, not unkindly. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you're about the last thing I expected to see out here." "Please," Clara said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm traveling west. I've been walking for days. Could you spare any food? I can pay." She fumbled for the coins in her hem, knowing they were pitifully few. The man studied her for a long moment, taking in her ragged dress, her gaunt face, her blood-stained boots. "Walking, you say? From where?" "Copper Creek." He whistled low. That's better than 60 miles back through the Diablos. You came through that alone? Clara nodded, too tired to elaborate. Name's Josiah Clement, he said, climbing down from the wagon. I freight supplies between Fort Buchanan and the mining camps. What's left of them, anyway. He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a canvas bag. Can't say as I've ever met a woman who walked through the Diablos alone and lived to tell it. He handed her the bag, waving away her coins. Keep your money. There's jerky in there, some biscuits, dried fruit. Got a spare canteen, too. Yours looks about done for. Clara's eyes burned with sudden tears at the unexpected kindness. Thank you, Mr. Clement. Thank you. Where you headed, if you don't mind my asking? California, the valleys. I heard there's work there. Clement's expression grew troubled. Ma'am, California's still near 300 miles from here. Through the Mogollons, across the Colorado. That's Apache country. Real Apache country. War parties have been active all summer. I have to try. Clara said simply, There's nothing behind me. He studied her again, then shook his head. I'm heading to Fort Buchanan with supplies. That's 40 miles north, opposite direction from where you're going. But there's a settlement about 30 miles west of here. Millerville. Still got people. Last I heard, small place, but they might have work. Better than trying to cross Apache territory alone. 30 miles, Clara repeated. It might as well have been 300, the way her body felt. Tell you what, Clement said. I can't take you there. Got contracts to fulfill. But there's an old line shack about 5 miles west, where the Forest Service used to stay. It's got walls and a roof, maybe even some supplies. You rest up there, get your strength back. The road to Millerville is better marked from there. He gave her directions, drawing a rough map in the dust. Before climbing back onto his wagon, he pressed something else into her hand, a small pistol, barely larger than her palm. It's only a .22, but it's better than nothing. 2 shots, that's all. Save them for when you really need them. Clara stared at the weapon, its weight alien in her hand. Mr. Clement, I can't. You cross the Diablos alone, he interrupted. That takes sand, but sand won't stop a bullet or turn away men with bad intentions. Take it. He climbed back onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. That line shack, stay there a few days. Get strong. The dead of winter's no time to be walking these mountains. But if you must go on, at least go rested. The wagon rolled away, leaving Clara standing in the empty street with a bag of food and a gun she didn't know how to use. The ghost town pressed around her, full of shadows and silence. She retreated to the hotel room where she'd found the trunk, barricading the door with the dresser before allowing herself to examine Clement's gifts. The food was simple trail fare, but there was enough for several days if she was careful. The canteen was military issue, larger than hers and in better condition. The pistol she wrapped in a piece of silk from the trunk and tucked into her bundle, hoping she'd never need to unwrap it. That night, lying on the musty bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and thought about roads, the road behind, littered with graves and broken dreams, the road ahead, uncertain and dangerous, and this strange middle ground where she found herself, neither the woman she'd been nor the one she might become. Thomas had believed in destiny, in God's plan for every soul. Clara had lost that faith the day the mine collapsed, but out here in the wilderness, she'd found something else. Not faith, exactly, but a kind of fierce determination that burned in her chest like a small, hot coal. She would survive because the alternative was unthinkable. She would reach California or die trying, but she would not go back. The wind moaned through the empty buildings, and somewhere in the darkness, a shutter banged repeatedly. Clara pulled the moldy blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would find the line shack. She would rest, recover her strength, and continue west. Each day was a victory, each mile a triumph over those who expected her to fail. In her dreams, she walked through endless forests while Thomas called her name from somewhere just beyond the trees. But when she woke in the gray dawn, she was alone, and the road was waiting. The lined shack stood exactly where Clement had described, a rough timber structure with a stone chimney nestled in a grove of ponderosa pines. Clara approached it as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, each step an act of will. The 5 miles from Silver Falls had taken her most of the day, her body finally rebelling against the abuse she'd subjected it to. Inside, the shack proved a blessing beyond her hopes. Rough bunks lined one wall, a pot-bellied stove squatted in the corner, and shelves held a few precious supplies, matches in a waterproof tin, a bag of cornmeal gone weevily but edible, even a battered coffee pot. Best of all, a spring bubbled up just outside the door, feeding a small pool before disappearing into the rocks. Clara built a fire with shaking hands, the warmth so welcome she nearly wept. She made a thin porridge with the cornmeal and some of Clement's jerky, the first hot meal she'd had in days. As darkness fell, she barricaded the door and collapsed onto one of the bunks, falling into a sleep so deep it was like drowning. She woke to sunlight streaming through the single window and the sound of voices outside. Men's voices, growing closer. Clara rolled from the bunk, grabbing the pistol with fumbling fingers. Through a crack in the wall, she saw them, 3 men leading tired horses, their clothes dusty and worn. "Told you there'd be a spring here," one said. "Old Mackenzie always knew the good spots. Wonder if there's anything left inside worth taking." Another replied, "Check the door. William." Clara's heart hammered as footsteps approached. The door rattled against her barricade. "Locked up tight," William called back. "Want me to force it? Leave it. We're losing daylight, and those claims won't stake themselves." Clara remained frozen until their voices faded into the forest. Gold seekers, heading for some new strike. Harmless this time, but a reminder that the wilderness wasn't as empty as it seemed. She spent the rest of the day recovering her strength, washing her clothes in the spring, tending to her battered feet. The sun felt like a blessing on her skin after so many days of struggle. On her second night in the shack, she was awakened by scratching at the walls. Not human, something with claws. A bear, perhaps, drawn by the scent of food. Clara lay rigid in the darkness, the pistol clutched uselessly in her hand. What good would a .22 do against a bear? The scratching continued, circled the shack, then finally moved away. She didn't sleep again until dawn. The third day brought her first real trial. She'd ventured out to gather firewood when she saw him, a lone figure on the trail, moving with the purposeless gait of the deeply drunk. As he drew closer, she recognized the type, a drifter, probably thrown out of the mining camps for theft or worse. His clothes were filthy, his beard matted, and he carried a half-empty whiskey bottle. Clara tried to slip back to the shack unseen, but he spotted her. His face split into a grin that made her skin crawl. Well, what have we here? A lady, all alone in the woods." She backed away as he approached, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "Stay back, I want no trouble." "No trouble at all," he slurred, still advancing. "Just being friendly. Man gets lonely out here. Bet you're lonely too, pretty thing like you." "I said stay back." Clara drew the knife, holding it steady despite her terror. The pistol was in the shack, useless to her now. He laughed, an ugly sound. "That pig sticker won't do you much good, sweetheart. Why don't you put it down and we can be friends?" He lunged suddenly, faster than his drunken appearance suggested. Clara sidestepped, slashing with the knife. The blade caught his arm. Drawing blood and a howl of rage, he swung the bottle at her head. She ducked, felt it whistle past her ear, and ran. The forest became a maze of trees and shadows as she fled. Behind her, the drunk crashed through the underbrush, cursing and threatening. Clara's feet, still tender from her journey, screamed with each step. She dodged between pines, leaped over fallen logs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A root caught her foot and she went down hard, the knife flying from her hand. Before she could rise, he was on her, reeking of whiskey and filth. His hands grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Gonna pay for cutting me, you—" Clara's fingers found a rock, smooth and heavy. She swung it with all her remaining strength, catching him on the temple. He grunted and fell sideways. She hit him again, then scrambled to her feet and ran without looking back. She reached the shack and slammed the door, piling everything movable against it. Through the window, she watched the trail, knife in one hand, pistol in the other. Hours passed. He didn't come. As twilight fell, she ventured out cautiously and found her knife where it had fallen. There was blood on the leaves, a trail leading away into the forest. He was gone, but for how long? That night, every sound was a threat. Clara sat awake by the dying fire, weapons within reach, starting at each pop of settling wood. When dawn finally came, she knew she couldn't stay. The shack had given her shelter and time to recover, but it was no fortress. If the drunk returned with friends, if other travelers proved less easily discouraged. She packed quickly, taking what supplies she could carry. The cornmeal went into Clement's bag, along with the matches and a battered tin cup she found. She filled both canteens at the spring, drinking deeply before setting out. According to Clement's directions, Millerville lay 25 miles west. One more day, maybe two, and she'd reach some semblance of civilization. The trail wound through forests and meadows, following the natural contours of the land. Clara moved steadily but carefully, alert for any sign of pursuit. Her body had recovered somewhat from the rest and food, though her feet still pained her with each step. The mountains rose around her, their peaks lost in clouds that promised either rain or snow. By afternoon, she'd covered perhaps 10 miles when she came upon a sight that stopped her cold. A wagon sat overturned beside the trail, its contents scattered across the ground. 2 horses lay dead in their traces, and the smell told her they'd been there for days. Clara approached cautiously, knife drawn. The driver lay beneath the wagon, his body crushed when it overturned. Natural causes, a spooked team, a moment's inattention on a narrow trail. Clara said a brief prayer over him, then pragmatically searched the wreckage. The man was beyond help, but his supplies might save her life. She found a wool blanket, relatively clean and whole, a canvas tarp that would serve as shelter. Best of all, a pair of sturdy boots that, while too large, were in far better condition than Thomas's worn ones. She took dried beans, a small pot, and a leather pouch containing almost $20 in gold coins, a fortune to her now. As she transferred supplies to her pack, she heard them, howls echoing through the canyon, wolves, and from the sound, hunting. Clara worked faster, knowing she needed shelter before nightfall. The dead horses would draw predators and scavengers alike. 5 miles further, she found a defensible position, a shallow cave in a cliff face. Barely more than an overhang, but with walls on 3 sides. She gathered firewood quickly, building a substantial pile. As darkness fell, she started her fire at the cave mouth, hoping the flames would keep the wolves at bay. They came with the full dark, shadows moving just beyond the firelight. Eyes reflected the flames. 2, 4, then 6 pairs. Clara fed the fire steadily, the pistol heavy in her lap. The wolves circled, patient and calculating. One, bolder than the rest, crept closer, its gray form materializing from the darkness. Clara stood slowly, a burning branch in one hand. "Get back," she said firmly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Go on, get—" The wolf paused, yellow eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, they regarded each other, 2 creatures surviving in a harsh land. Then it turned and melted back into the night. The pack remained nearby. Their presence felt more than seen, but they came no closer. She dozed fitfully, starting awake to feed the fire. In the gray hour before dawn, she realized the wolves were gone. They'd returned to the easier meal she'd left behind. Clara packed quickly and moved on, wanting distance between herself and the carrion that would soon draw bears and buzzards. The new boots made walking easier, though she stuffed them with grass to make them fit better. The trail began to descend, winding down from the high country. Trees grew thicker, and she began to see signs of human passage, blazes on trees, a campfire ring, even a discarded horseshoe. It was late afternoon when she smelled it. Wood smoke, but not wildfire. Chimney smoke, carrying hints of cooking food. Clara's pace quickened despite her exhaustion. Through the trees, she glimpsed buildings, heard the ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Millerville appeared as she crested the final ridge. Not much of a town, perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a single street, but alive. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses stood at hitching posts, and she could see people moving between buildings. Real people, living ordinary lives. Clara paused at the town's edge, suddenly aware of her appearance. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair matted despite her attempts to clean it. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd walked through hell and emerged on the other side. But she was alive, and she'd made it this far on her own strength and will. She thought of Thomas then, of his gentle hands and patient voice. "Don't let anyone decide your worth," he'd said. Clara straightened her shoulders and walked into Millerville, ready to face whatever came next. She'd proven she could survive the wilderness. Now she had to prove she could survive among people again. The main street of Millerville stretched before Clara like a gauntlet she had to run. Every step sent fresh agony through her battered feet, but she forced herself to walk steadily, chin high despite the stares from townspeople. A woman sweeping her store's entrance paused mid-stroke, mouth agape. Two men loading grain sacks onto a wagon stopped their work to watch her pass. She must have looked like a specter risen from the desert. The general store sat in the middle of town, its painted sign proclaiming Henderson's Dry Goods and Supplies. Clara pushed through the door, a bell tinkling overhead. The familiar scents of coffee, leather, and pickle brine washed over her, so normal it made her knees weak. Behind the counter stood a thin man with spectacles, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. "Ma'am?" His voice held a mixture of concern and wariness. Do you need help?" "Work," Clara managed, her voice raw from disuse. "I need work, and—" She reached for the leather pouch, her fingers trembling. "Supplies. I can pay." Henderson, for this must be the proprietor, came around the counter slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "You look about done in. If you don't mind my saying, there's a chair here. Please, sit." Clara sank into the offered chair, her body suddenly aware of every mile she'd walked. Henderson poured water from a pitcher, pressing the glass into her hands. She drank slowly, conscious of his scrutiny. "You traveling alone?" he asked carefully. "Yes, from Copper Creek, through the mountains." His eyebrows rose. "That's near 100 miles of hard country." "You walked?" Clara nodded, too exhausted for elaborate explanations. Henderson studied her for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "My wife Mary runs a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean place, respectable. You look like you could use a hot meal and a proper bed. As for work..." He glanced at her hands, noting the calluses and cuts. "Can you sew? Cook? The hotel's been looking for help since their girl ran off with a traveling salesman." Hope flickered in Clara's chest. "I can do both. I'm a hard worker. Mr. Henderson, I don't need charity, just a chance." "I believe you," he said simply. "Tell you what, let me send word to Mary. She'll get you settled. Tomorrow, when you're rested. You can speak to Mr. Garrett at the hotel. He's particular, but fair." The boarding house proved to be a 2-story clapboard building painted white with green shutters. Mary Henderson was as thin as her husband, but with kind eyes that reminded Clara of her grandmother. She took one look at Clara and began issuing orders with the efficiency of a field general. "Bath first," she declared. "Then food. Questions can wait." The bath was heaven itself, hot water in a copper tub, real soap that smelled of lavender, clean towels rough against her weathered skin. Clara scrubbed away layers of dirt and sweat, watching the water turn brown, then gray. Her reflection in the small mirror shocked her. Hollow cheeks, sun-darkened skin stretched tight over bones, eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in 2 weeks. Mary had laid out clean clothes, a simple calico dress, undergarments, stockings. They hung loose on Clara's diminished frame, but felt like the finest silk after her trail-worn rags. When she emerged, she found a meal waiting: beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread with butter, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Clara ate slowly, her shrunken stomach protesting the richness. "No need to tell me the whole tale," Mary said, sitting across from her with her own cup of coffee. "A woman doesn't walk 100 miles through the mountains without good reason. What matters is you're here now. The room's $1 a week, includes breakfast and supper. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." Clara slept that night in a real bed with clean sheets, but her dreams were full of wolves and wind. She woke several times, heart racing, before remembering where she was. Safety felt more foreign than danger after so many nights in the wild. Morning brought new challenges. Clara dressed carefully, pinning her hair into a semblance of respectability. The hotel sat at the far end of town, a 3-story building that had seen better days but still maintained pretensions of grandeur. Mr. Garrett proved to be a florid man with mutton chop whiskers and a perpetual frown. "Mrs. Henderson sent word," he said, looking Clara up and down with the air of a man examining livestock. "Says you need work. What experience have you?" "I've kept house for 5 years, sir, cooking, cleaning, mending. I also took in washing and worked at the church socials back in Copper Creek." "Copper Creek," he sniffed. "Mining town. Rough place. We run a respectable establishment here. Mrs. Hartley. I'm a widow, sir." Well, Mrs. Hartley, I'll be frank. You look like you've been through hard times. I need someone reliable, not someone who'll collapse at the first sign of real work." Clara straightened her spine. "Mr. Garrett, I walked 100 miles through desert and mountains alone. I survived sandstorms, wolves, and worse. I don't collapse." Something in her tone must have convinced him. "Kitchen work primarily. Some cleaning, 6 in the morning until 8 at night. Half-day Sundays. Room and board plus $2 a week. You can start tomorrow on a trial basis. 1 week to prove yourself." It was less than she'd hoped, but more than she'd had in months. Clara accepted with gratitude. The work was hard, but blessedly ordinary. She rose before dawn to help Cookie, an elderly black man who'd been with the hotel since its founding, prepare breakfast for the guests. Flapjacks, bacon, eggs, biscuits. The smell of frying food made her stomach growl even after she'd eaten. Between meals, she scrubbed pots, swept floors, changed linens, mended torn curtains and tablecloths. Cookie, whose real name was Cornelius, took her under his wing. "You got the look," he said on her 3rd day, watching her work. "Seen it before. Someone who's been down so far they thought they'd never get up again. But you're here, working. That's what matters." The other staff kept their distance initially. There was Sarah, a young woman who cleaned the guest rooms and giggled at everything. James, the handyman who smelled perpetually of whiskey. And Mrs. Potts, the head housekeeper who ruled her domain with an iron fist. They watched Clara with curious eyes, waiting to see if she'd last. By the end of the week, her body had begun to recover. Regular meals filled out her gaunt cheeks. The constant work, while exhausting, was nothing compared to the trek through the mountains. When Mr. Garrett grudgingly admitted she could stay on permanently, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But peace was fragile in a frontier town. On her 10th day in Millerville, trouble arrived in the form of 3 riders. Clara was serving dinner in the hotel dining room when they entered. Trail-dirty men with hard eyes and low-slung guns. One of them, a heavy-set man with a scar across his jaw, looked familiar. It wasn't until he spoke that she realized why. "Whiskey," he growled at Sarah. "And keep it coming." The voice sent ice through Clara's veins. He'd been one of the hide hunters she'd hidden from in the desert. As if sensing her recognition, his eyes swept the room and landed on her. For a moment, confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly. "Boys, Look here. Remember that pretty widow we were talking about? The one heading west from Copper Creek? Clara forced herself to continue pouring coffee for a guest, her hands miraculously steady. The hide hunter's companions turned to stare. Thought sure you'd be bones by now. The scarred man continued. How'd a little thing like you make it through the Diablos? Please, sir, Clara said quietly. I'm working. If you need service, Sarah will help you. Oh, I think you can help me just fine, he said, rising from his chair. The room had gone silent, other diners watching nervously. Come on over here, let's get reacquainted. The lady said she's working. Cookie's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He stood there with a meat cleaver in one hand, casual but ready. This is a respectable establishment. You want to eat and drink, sit down and mind your manners. Otherwise, doors that way. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara saw the hunter's hand twitch toward his gun, saw Cookie shift his weight slightly. Then Mr. Garrett appeared, red-faced and blustering. Gentlemen, please, this is a dining room, not a saloon. If you can't behave properly, I'll have to ask you to leave. The scarred man looked around, calculating odds. The other diners had shrunk back, but several men had stood up, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Millerville might be small, but it protected its own. No trouble intended, the hunter said finally, settling back into his chair. But his eyes never left Clara. Just surprised to see an old acquaintance. The rest of the dinner service passed in tense silence. Clara worked mechanically, aware of the hunter's eyes following her every move. When they finally left, tossing coins on the table, Cookie walked her to the boarding house. They'll be back, he said simply. Men like that don't forget. You might think about moving on. But Clara had done enough running. This is my home now, she said. I won't be driven out again. That night, she loaded the little pistol Josiah Clement had given her and placed it under her pillow. She'd walked through hell to reach this place, to build this new life. If the hide hunters wanted trouble, they'd find she was no longer the desperate woman who'd hidden in the darkness. The desert had burned away her softness, leaving something harder in its place. As she lay in bed, Clara thought about the road that had brought her here. Each mile had carved away a piece of the woman she'd been, revealing someone she was still learning to recognize. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did in a place like Millerville. But tonight, she had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and work for her hands. It was enough. It was everything. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed road jolted Clara from her exhausted stupor. She'd been walking for hours since fleeing Millerville at dawn, the hide hunter's threats still echoing in her ears. They'd returned as Cookie predicted, making it clear she had two choices: leave town or face consequences no decent woman should endure. Pride had carried her through the desert, but pride couldn't stop bullets or turn away men bent on violence. So she'd gathered her few possessions and slipped away before first light, taking the western road toward California once more. Now, 50 miles from Millerville, and nearly delirious with exhaustion. She swayed on her feet as a lone rider approached through the desert haze. Clara's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at her belt, though she could barely lift her arm. The figure materialized slowly, a tall man on a bay horse, leading a pack mule. Not the hide hunters. Thank God. As he drew closer, she saw he was well dressed for the frontier. Clean leather vest, quality boots, a hat that hadn't seen too many seasons. Ma'am. The rider pulled up several yards away, his voice carrying concern and caution in equal measure. Are you all right? Clara tried to answer, but her throat was too parched. She'd run out of water that morning, and the autumn sun, though not as fierce as summer's, still beat down mercilessly. Her knees buckled, and she sank toward the ground. The man was off his horse in one smooth motion, catching her before she hit the dirt. Easy now, he said, supporting her weight. Up close. She could see he was perhaps 35, with weathered features that spoke of years under the western sun and eyes the color of winter sky. He guided her to a flat rock in the shade of a Joshua tree. then retrieved a canteen from his saddlebag. "Small sips," he instructed, holding it to her cracked lips. The water was warm, but tasted like salvation. "Thank you," Clara managed after several careful swallows. "Jacob Morrison," he said, crouching beside her. "I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here. You're in a bad way, ma'am." "How long have you been walking?" Since before dawn, from Millerville." His eyebrows rose. "That's near 50 miles? On foot?" He studied her more carefully, taking in her worn dress, her dust-caked appearance, the determined set of her jaw despite her exhaustion. "You running from something or toward something?" "Both," Clara admitted. There seemed no point in lying to the man who just saved her life. Jacob was quiet for a moment, then stood. "Well, you can't go any further today. My ranch isn't far. You need rest, food, and proper shelter. After that," he shrugged. "After that, you can decide what comes next." Clara wanted to protest, to insist she could continue, but her body had reached its limits. When she tried to stand, the world spun dangerously. "I don't want to impose, ma'am. Leaving you out here would be murder, plain and simple. I've got a spare room and a housekeeper who'd skin me alive if I didn't offer help to someone in need. Can you ride?" With his help, Clara managed to mount his horse while he walked alongside, leading both animals. The ranch, when it came into view, took her breath away, not for its grandeur, though the 2-story house with its wraparound porch was finer than anything in Copper Creek, but for its sense of solid permanence. Corrals held healthy horses, gardens flanked the house, and cottonwoods provided shade. It spoke of roots put down deep, of someone who'd built something to last. "Built it myself," Jacob said, noticing her attention. "Took 5 years, but I wanted it done right. Started with nothing but a claim and 200 head of cattle. Now I run near 1,000. A Mexican woman emerged from the house as they approached, her face creasing with concern. "Dios mío, what has happened?" "Found her on the road. Rosa, she needs tending." Rosa clicked her tongue and took charge immediately, helping Clara into the house. The interior was simple but well-appointed. Leather furniture, Navajo rugs, shelves lined with books. It was a bachelor's home, but one that showed care and pride. "Come," Rosa said firmly. "Bath first, then food, then sleep. Questions later." The bath was Clara's second salvation of the day. Rosa helped her wash the trail dust away, exclaiming softly over her blistered feet and sunburned skin. Fresh clothes appeared, a simple blue dress that must have belonged to Rosa's daughter, clean undergarments, soft slippers. When Clara emerged, she found a meal waiting, soup thick with vegetables and beef, fresh bread, cool buttermilk. Jacob sat across from her as she ate, saying little, finally. When she'd finished, he spoke. "I won't ask what you're running from, that's your business, but I know desperation when I see it, and you've got the look of someone who's been pushed past all reasonable limits." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm a widow. My husband died in a mine collapse back in Copper Creek. I tried to make a new start in Millerville, but some men have long memories and bad intentions. It was leave or face worse." "Hide hunters?" She nodded, surprised by his perception. "They come through sometimes, looking for water. Rough bunch." He was quiet for a moment. "You were walking to California?" "I have to get somewhere they won't follow, somewhere I can disappear, start over properly. That's another 200 miles through hard country. Apache raids have been bad this year, and winter's coming on." He stood, pacing to the window. "Look, Mrs. Hartley, Clara Hartley." "Mrs. Hartley, I'm going to make you an offer. No strings, no expectations. Stay here through the winter. Rosa needs help with the house. It's too much for her alone. Come spring, if you still want to go to California, I'll see you get there safely. Stage fare, proper escort, whatever you need." Clara stared at him, searching for the catch. In her experience, men didn't make offers without expecting something in return. "Why would you do that?" Jacob turned from the window, and she saw something in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own, though he tried to hide it. My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our daughter both. I built this place for a family that's gone now. Rosa keeps telling me the house needs life in it again." He smiled slightly. "Besides, anyone who walks 150 miles through hell and keeps going has earned a chance to catch their breath." "I don't need charity," Clara said quietly, "and I'm not offering it." "You'll work for your keep, same as anyone. Rosa will be glad for the help, and God knows the house could use a woman's touch. The men respect me enough not to cause trouble, and if those hide hunters come around, they'll find this ranch isn't some mining town they can intimidate." Clara considered his words. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to trust no one, but her body was failing, and winter in the mountains would be deadly. This man had shown her more genuine kindness than she'd encountered since Thomas died. Perhaps it was time to stop running, at least for a while. "All right," she said finally. "Through the winter. But I pay my own way to California come spring." "Stubborn," Jacob observed. "That'll serve you well out here." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the Double J Ranch, Mrs. Hartley." His handshake was firm, calloused from honest work, for the first time in months. Clara felt something besides fear and exhaustion. Not quite hope. She'd learned the danger of hope, but a sense that perhaps she'd found safe harbor, however temporary. Rosa showed her to a room at the back of the house, small but clean, with a window overlooking the kitchen garden. "You rest now," the older woman said kindly. "Tomorrow is soon enough to start work. Tonight, you sleep without fear." Clara sank onto the bed, her body finally able to release the tension it had carried for so long. Through the window, she could see Jacob in the corral, working with a young horse. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, at peace with his place in the world. She thought of Thomas then, of the dreams they'd shared. He would have liked this place, would have appreciated what Jacob had built from nothing. The thought brought tears, but for the first time, they weren't entirely bitter. Perhaps Thomas's final gift hadn't been the pocket watch she'd buried, but the strength he'd always seen in her, the strength that had carried her across impossible miles to this moment. As darkness fell over the Double J Ranch, Clara Hartley closed her eyes and slept without dreams, safe for the first time since her world had collapsed with a mine shaft back in Copper Creek. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments. But tonight, she was simply a weary traveler who'd found shelter from the storm. The first weeks at the Double J Ranch passed in a rhythm of simple tasks that slowly mended Clara's battered spirit. She rose before dawn to help Rosa prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, a dozen men who touched their hats respectfully when she served their coffee and biscuits. The work was familiar yet different from her life in Copper Creek. Here, there was abundance instead of scarcity, purpose instead of mere survival. Jacob kept a respectful distance, joining them for evening meals but otherwise occupied with the endless demands of running a cattle ranch. Clara found herself watching him sometimes, the way he handled a spooked horse with patience, how he settled disputes among the men with quiet authority, his habit of reading by lamplight after supper. He was nothing like Thomas, who had been all quick laughter and easy charm. Jacob carried a stillness about him, like deep water. Rosa proved to be more than a housekeeper. She became Clara's guide to this new world. "Senor Jacob, he is a good man," she said one afternoon as they preserved late peaches from the orchard. "But lonely, the house, it has been too quiet since—" She crossed herself. "Since the fever took Senora Margaret and little Anna." Clara learned the story in pieces. Margaret had been a schoolteacher from back east, drawn to adventure and to the quiet rancher who'd courted her with poetry and wildflowers. They'd been married only 5 years when the fever struck. Jacob had nearly gone mad with grief. Rosa confided, working himself to exhaustion, speaking to no one for months. "He built that." Rosa pointed through the window to a small cottage near the main barn. "For Margaret's parents," he said, "when they would visit. But they never came. Too far, too wild for them here." As autumn deepened, Clara found herself settling into ranch life. She learned to gather eggs without disturbing the temperamental hens, to bake bread in the temperamental oven, to mend shirts torn by barbed wire and hard work. Her hands, already calloused from her journey, grew strong and capable. One evening, Jacob found her in the garden, pulling the last of the carrots before the first hard freeze. The sunset painted the mountains purple and gold, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its evening song. "You've brought something back," he said quietly, leaning against the garden gate. "Life." Rosa was right. The house needed it. Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "It's good work. Honest work. I'm grateful for the chance." "You've more than earned your keep. Rosa sings your praises daily." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "I've been thinking. Winter's coming on hard. They say you might consider. That is, the ranch could use someone like you, permanent-like. If you wanted to stay." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warming she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she wanted. "Mr. Morrison. Jacob, please. Jacob." The name felt strange on her tongue. "I appreciate everything you've done, but come spring, I need to keep moving. I can't. I'm not ready for anything more than work and shelter." He nodded, no disappointment showing on his weathered face. "I understand. The offer stands. Whenever you're ready, or never, if that's your choice. You're safe here either way." As the weeks passed, their evening conversations grew longer. Jacob shared stories of building the ranch, of cattle drives and flash floods, of the year grasshoppers ate everything green for miles. Clara found herself talking too, about Thomas, about the mine, about her journey through the desert. He listened without judgment, asking few questions, simply accepting her words as gifts. The first snow came early, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Clara stood at her window watching fat flakes fall, remembering another winter, another window. But this time she was warm, fed, safe. The difference was almost painful in its sweetness. One night, she woke to voices in the main room, male voices, loud and slurred with drink. Her blood froze as she recognized the scarred hide hunter from Millerville. Heart pounding, she reached for the pistol she still kept close, then crept to her door. "No, she's here," the hunter was saying. "Widow woman, dark hair, pretty enough despite the wear, came through Millerville couple months back. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Jacob's voice was calm, but Clara heard steel beneath it. "And I'd remember. Don't get many visitors out here. Maybe you need your memory refreshed." Another voice, younger, meaner. "Maybe you need to get off my property." The distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. "You're drunk, you're armed, and you're unwelcome. That's 3 good reasons to leave." Clara pressed her eye to the crack under the door. She could see Jacob standing near the fireplace, a Winchester steady in his hands. 2 of his men flanked him, similarly armed. The hide hunters, 3 of them, stood near the entrance, tension crackling between the groups. "No need for unpleasantness," the scarred one said, but his bravado had dimmed. "We're just looking for someone who done us wrong, stole from us. Only thieves here are the ones standing in my doorway uninvited." Jacob's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Juan, show these gentlemen out. If they're not off my land in 10 minutes, they can explain themselves to the sheriff. After they heal up." The confrontation stretched taut for another heartbeat, then broke. The hunters retreated, muttering threats and curses. Clara heard horses riding away fast, then silence. She stayed frozen behind her door until a soft knock made her jump. "Mrs. Hartley?" Jacob's voice. "They're gone. You can come out." Clara emerged, the pistol still clutched in her trembling hand. Jacob took in her appearance. Nightgown, bare feet, weapon at the ready, and something softened in his expression. "You would have fought," he said, not a question. "I've run far enough." Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I won't run anymore." "Good, because you don't have to. They won't be back. Men like that are cowards at heart, but if they try—" He gestured to his men, who nodded grimly. The Double J protects its own. Rosa appeared with a pot of coffee, clucking over Clara like a mother hen. As the men discussed increasing patrols and watches, Clara felt something she'd thought lost forever, the sense of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than her own survival. Later, as the house settled back into quiet, Jacob lingered. "I'm sorry they found you. Thought you'd have more time before. You couldn't have known." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And you didn't have to stand up for me? Could have just told them where I was. Avoided the trouble." He looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would I do that? You're under my roof, under my protection. That means something out here." He paused at the doorway. "Besides, anyone who'd walked through hell and survived deserves better than to be dragged back by the likes of them." After he left, Clara sat by the dying fire, thinking. For months, she'd focused only on surviving the next day, the next mile. She'd built walls around her heart as surely as Jacob had built this ranch. But tonight, facing danger, she'd been ready to fight not just for her life, but for this place, these people who'd taken her in. Thomas had always said she was stronger than she knew, but strength, she was learning, wasn't just about enduring alone. Sometimes it was about accepting help, about finding a place to stand and defend. The Double J Ranch was supposed to be a way station, a pause in her journey to somewhere else. But as snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in clean white silence, Clara wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd already arrived where she was meant to be. The thought terrified her. Trust was dangerous, hope more so. She'd lost everything once. She couldn't survive it again. But as she finally returned to her bed, she caught herself thinking not of escape routes in California valleys, but of spring planting and whether Jacob might teach her to ride properly and if Rosa would share her recipe for that miraculous apple pie. Dangerous thoughts. But on this night, with safety wrapped around her like a warm blanket and good people ready to fight for her, Clara allowed herself the luxury of imagining a future that consisted of more than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was home. Winter held the ranch in its crystalline grip, but inside the Double J warmth bloomed in unexpected ways. The incident with the hide hunters had shifted something fundamental. Clara no longer felt like a guest earning her keep. She'd become part of the ranch's heartbeat. The men tipped their hats with genuine respect. Rosa consulted her on household decisions. And Jacob's presence had become a constant she hadn't realized she was learning to depend on. News traveled slowly in winter, but it traveled nonetheless. One gray February morning, a traveling merchant brought more than supplies. He brought gossip from Millerville and beyond. As he warmed himself by the kitchen fire, accepting Rosa's coffee gratefully, he regaled them with tales from the settlements. "Strangest thing happened in Fort Buchanan," he said, unwrapping his frozen fingers around the hot mug. 3 hide hunters found shot dead on the trail. Sheriff figured it was claim jumpers or Apache, but, he leaned in conspiratorially, found them with playing cards in their hands, aces and eights, every one of them. Dead man's hand. Clara's blood chilled, but she kept her hands steady as she poured more coffee. Jacob, seated across the table, showed no reaction beyond mild interest. "Dangerous territory," he observed. "Men who live by violence often die by it." After the merchant left, laden with orders for spring supplies, Clara found Jacob in the barn, checking on a mare ready to foal. "Those hunters," she began, "are no longer a concern," he said simply, running practiced hands along the mare's flanks. "Justice has a way of finding men like that. Best not to question how." She studied his profile in the lamplight, seeing new shadows there. I didn't leave the ranch." His eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Neither did any of my men. Bill Hutchinson's a good sheriff, thorough. If he says it was claim jumpers," he shrugged, "then that's what it was." Clara understood. Out here, justice wore many faces, not all of them official. The relief she felt disturbed her. When had she become someone who could be grateful for men's deaths? But then she remembered their leering faces, their threats, the fear that had driven her from Millerville. Perhaps Thomas would have understood. Perhaps surviving changed you in ways that comfortable people could never comprehend. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, melting snow revealing the green promises beneath. Clara found herself dreading its arrival. Each warmer day meant she was closer to the decision she'd have to make. Continue to California or what? Stay? Accept what was growing between her and Jacob. Obvious to everyone, but spoken by neither. The answer came in unexpected form. Clara was hanging wash when she saw riders approaching, a man and woman in Eastern clothes, looking uncomfortable on their rented horses. City people, clearly, picking their way carefully along the muddy road. "Can I help you?" Clara called, wiping her hands on her apron. The woman, middle-aged with graying hair beneath a fashionable bonnet, dismounted awkwardly. "We're looking for Mr. Jacob Morrison. Is this the Double J Ranch?" "It is." "He's in the north pasture, but I can send someone." "You must be the housekeeper," the woman interrupted, not unkindly. "I'm Mrs. Adelaide Winters, and this is my husband, Charles. We were Margaret's parents." Clara's heart sank. Margaret, Jacob's wife. These were the in-laws who'd never visited, who'd been too frightened of the frontier to see their daughter's life. "Please come inside. I'll send word to Mr. Morrison." While Rosa fussed over the unexpected guests, Clara found Juan and sent him racing to find Jacob. She tried to fade into the background, but Mrs. Winters seemed determined to talk. "Such a long journey." She sighed, settling into the parlor chair like a bird alighting somewhere foreign. "We should have come years ago, when Margaret asked, but Charles's health and the distance. We always thought there would be time." Mr. Winters, a thin man with scholarly spectacles, studied the room with obvious surprise. "It's not what we expected," he admitted. Margaret's letters made it sound so primitive, but this is quite civilized. Jacob built it for her, Clara said quietly, unable to help herself. Everything here he made with his own hands to give her a proper home. Mrs. Winters' eyes filled with tears. "She wrote of that, how proud she was. We didn't understand. Thought she was just trying to make us feel better about her choice." Jacob arrived within the hour, dusty from work but composed. The reunion was stiff, formal, weighted with old grief and older regrets. Clara busied herself with Rosa in the kitchen, but the voices carried, "We've come to make amends," Mr. Winters was saying, "and to see where our daughter lived, where she's buried." Also, Mrs. Winters added hesitantly, "Margaret wrote of a woman, in her last letter, before the fever. She said you'd found someone, that she was glad you wouldn't be alone. We thought, that is, we hoped." Clara froze, coffee pot in hand. Margaret had written about her, but that was impossible. Margaret had died 3 years ago, long before Clara arrived. Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "You misunderstood. Adelaide, Margaret was ill when she wrote that. Fevered. There was no woman then." "Oh." The disappointment was palpable. "We'd so hoped. She worried about you being alone. Said the ranch was too quiet without children's laughter." Clara couldn't help herself. She peered around the door frame to see Jacob's face tight with controlled pain. Margaret said many things near the end. The fever, it gave her visions. But Mrs. Winters wasn't finished. She was quite specific. Said she'd dreamed of a dark-haired woman who'd walked through fire to get here. Said you'd fight for her when others wouldn't. That she'd bring life back to the house. We thought perhaps she'd met someone in town. Was trying to play matchmaker even then. The room fell silent. Clara realized she'd stopped breathing. Rosa nudged her gently. "Go on," the older woman whispered. "They need coffee." Clara entered the parlor on unsteady legs, aware of every eye upon her. Jacob's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes when he looked at her. She served coffee with hands that barely trembled. then tried to retreat. "Wait, Mrs." Winters said softly, studying Clara with sharp intelligence. "You're not just the housekeeper, are you? You're the woman from Margaret's dream." I work here, ma'am. I help Rosa with the house." "Dark hair, Mrs." Winters continued, almost to herself. "And you've been through trials. I can see it in your bearing. Charles, look at her hands. Those aren't the hands of someone raised to service. Adelaide, Mr. Winters warned gently. But his wife was smiling now, a sad but genuine expression. Margaret knew things sometimes, called it her gift, said she dreamed true dreams. She looked between Clara and Jacob. She'd be glad, that's all. She'd be glad. The visit stretched through dinner, the Winters slowly relaxing as they saw the life Jacob had built. They walked to the small cemetery on the hill, where Margaret and Anna lay beneath simple stones. Clara hung back, but Mrs. Winters drew her forward. "You'll tend them?" she asked simply. "Of course. Good. That's good." The Winters left the next morning, pressing Jacob to visit them in Boston, extracting promises Clara suspected he wouldn't keep. But something had shifted with their visit, as if Margaret herself had given a blessing from beyond. That evening, Jacob found Clara in the garden, planting the first of the spring vegetables. The sunset painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs. "Did she really dream about me?" Clara asked without preamble. Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, the night before she died, she was lucid for a few hours. "She told me not to mourn too long. Said someone was coming who'd need what I could offer: safety, purpose, a place to heal. She described you perfectly, right down to the dress you wore when I found you on the road." Clara's hands stilled in the dark soil. "That's impossible. Lot of impossible things prove true out here." He knelt beside her, taking one of her earth-stained hands in his. "Clara, I need to say this plain. I'm not asking you to replace Margaret. No one could. But what I feel, what's grown between us, it's real and it's mine. Ours, if you'll have it." She looked at their joined hands, his scarred by work and weather, hers marked by her own journey through hardship. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "I lost everything once. I don't know if I can risk that again." "Life's all risk," he said gently. "But some things are worth it. You taught me that, walking through hell for a chance at something better. Question is, have you found it? Here?" Clara thought of the road that had brought her to this moment, the grief, the desert, the storms both internal and external. She'd left Copper Creek as one woman and arrived at the Double J as another, somewhere between the first step and the last. She'd been forged into someone who could stand and fight instead of run. "Yes," she whispered. "I found it." Jacob's smile transformed his weathered face. "Then stop looking for reasons to leave and start finding reasons to stay." As spring bloomed fully across the ranch, so did something new between them. Not a replacement for what either had lost, but something entirely their own. The house filled with laughter again. The men grinned knowingly, and Rosa sang in the kitchen. They married in June, in the garden Clara had planted, with wildflowers in her hair and Thomas's wedding ring transformed into a pendant at her throat, the past honored but not binding. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by the ranch family they'd built together. That night, as Clara stood on the porch of what was now truly her home, Jacob beside her solid and sure. She thought about roads not taken. California still existed somewhere beyond the mountains, but it was no longer her destination. She'd walked through desert and storm, through fear and grief, to arrive exactly where she belonged. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, reading her mood with the intuition of a man who'd learned to truly see her. "None," Clara said, and meant it. "I'm home." In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The desert had tested her, but it had also delivered her to this place, this moment, this unexpected grace. Clara Morrison, who had been Clara Hartley, who had once been nobody at all, stood rooted in the good earth of the Double J Ranch and knew that some journeys end not in the place you intended, but in the place you're meant to be. The road still called sometimes, in dreams and quiet moments, but its voice grew fainter with each passing season, drowned out by the richer sounds of home, cattle lowing, horses nickering, Rosa's laughter, Jacob's steady presence, and eventually, impossibly, beautifully, the cries of new life beginning. The desert had taken everything from Clara once. In return, it had given her the strength to build something better from the ashes, and that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all. Thank you for listening to this story of survival, hope, and unexpected love in the Old West. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Let us know in the comments below so we can connect with listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Clara and Jacob's journey. What part of their story touched you most?